All right. Well, welcome on in to Third Down Analysis Podcast. I'm your host, Danny Jackson, and we're going to talk today about Kansas State. Quick wrap up there, a couple notes. We're going to talk about Baylor, and then going to do a little bit of a look around at the Big 12 this week, a couple of other games outside of the Big 12, and then we're going to talk about the Big 12 title race. So let's jump on in. Thanks for jumping on in. The show is sponsored by your favorite puns. Fall is coming, so you don't have to leave me alone because, well, I love the fall. Anyways, all right. So Kansas State, by the way, I get a kick out of those puns every single time, so hopefully you do too. Kansas State, I want to talk through a couple points. It's been covered really well so far. You watch the BYU Sports TV BYU TV Sports guys. They've covered this well. I think after the game there was great coverage. So I've looked at different thoughts across the spectrum from Kansas State fans, from BYU fans, and from across the nation. And there were a couple of themes that I've seen. The first key theme that I saw was that the opinions, I should say, they ranged from shock that BYU won to Kansas State gave that away to BYU dominated. And I think the two ends of the spectrum are that BYU dominated the game, and the other end of the spectrum is that Kansas State gave the game away. So I think the answer is somewhere in between there. But what I want to hit on is first the BYU defense, and then I want to talk about this question of is Kansas State actually better than BYU, or is BYU actually better than Kansas State, and why I think that has significance going forward. But the first point on BYU's defense, it's been covered well. I think everyone has now stated that BYU's defense is the real deal. What's funny is if you go back to one of the episodes I had in the summer where I brought on Alex Hymas and Spencer Cornett, we did BYU hot takes, and Spencer said BYU's defense was going to be top 30. He said Jay Hill was going to have BYU in the top 30. And they're arguably top 30 defense. They might even be better by the time the season ends. And I think within the Big 12, I believe they're going to be a top 3 defense in the Big 12. I think what I'm seeing right now, the way it's shaking out, is you've got Utah, BYU, and Iowa State. Not necessarily in those orders, but I'd probably put actually Iowa State and Utah as 1A, 1B, and then BYU is 3. And Baylor's got a good defense. We'll get into that. But and the rest of the teams do have good defenses. I mean, Kansas State has a really good defense as well. But BYU's got a real shot here. Now, in the red zone defense, quick note, has shown itself. You've heard all the stats now about BYU and the number of TDs that they haven't allowed this season. They haven't allowed a passing touchdown. They haven't allowed a touchdown against a P4 opponent. I looked to see where they ranked nationally in touchdowns allowed, and they are sitting at they're 18th in the country. Well, they're tied. Really, they're tied for 17. There's 5 or 6 schools that are tied with four offensive touchdowns allowed. And so BYU's allowed 4 rushing touchdowns. They allowed 2 to Southern Illinois and then 2 to Wyoming. So not a single. Of note, in the Big 12, Iowa State has allowed 3 offensive touchdowns, and so they are tied for 11th best in the country. And they're the best in the Big 12, and then BYU's the second best. And then the next best would be UCF and Utah. They've both allowed 6 touchdowns. Of note, Kansas State, they have allowed 7 touchdowns, and then our friends Baylor that we're playing this week, they've also allowed 7. They've allowed 4 passing and 3 rushing. Most of that was last week against Colorado. So the red zone defense has been really good, and we saw that against Kansas State. I'll jump into that for a minute when we talk about Kansas State. Is Kansas State actually better? But the one thing I do think is a trouble spot is the rushing game. BYU did allow, what was it? It was, I think it was like 235 yards in that range to Kansas State. So even though that ended up working out for BYU, it was still a problem. In fact, I'm going to look this up right now here. The number of yards that they allowed. Yeah, I'm just checking this out here. Rush. Okay, let's see how many yards did they allow to Kansas State. It was. Oh, that was how many rushing yards they had. Oops, wrong metric. That was they had 92 rushing yards against Kansas State. Let's see. Yes, so they gave up 228 rushing yards against Kansas State. So not great. And the rest of the year they'd allowed 77 against Wyoming, 117 against SMU, 123 against Southern Illinois. And Kansas State has been Kansas State is one of the better. They are one of the better rushing teams in the country. They are right now. They're 17th best in the country. They average 241 yards per game. So BYU held them a little bit under, but that's pretty close. And the reason I think this is a trouble spot for BYU if they don't continue to improve is coming up on the schedule. You've got 4 teams in particular who rush the ball really well. Here's the thing: is Kansas State, they moved the ball really well from the 20 to the 20, and particularly on the ground. Then they'd get into the red zone, and I think what was happening where they were struggling. One, they had the penalties, and we'll hit on that in a minute, but they struggled because. But one of the reasons why I think they struggled is because Avery Johnson was not a passing threat. And so BYU knew Kansas State's likely going to run the ball. And because they're going to run the ball, your safeties, you already don't have to get that much depth at that point of the field because your safety's already pretty much sitting at the goal line. And they've got they've got to backpedal 5 yards or so, and then they pretty much it's hard to get beat over the top at that point in the field. So they almost get a play up in the box, and when you're not expecting Kansas State to throw a corner fade, or when you're not expecting them to really throw any kind of crossing routes, those safeties get a cheat up a little bit, or they know that they don't have to be on the lookout for that. So. That's where I think Kansas State was hurting themselves, and that's something they'll have to address going forward. But when you look at the rest of BYU's schedule and some of the teams that they're playing up here soon, UCF, so actually Oklahoma State is the next one that's got a really good ground game. Interestingly, they're not doing this well this year. They haven't. It took them about this point last year before they finally got the Ollie Gordon engine revving. It was, I think, game 4 or 5 for them. And so we'll see how they do this week against Kansas State. But Oklahoma State, they're only averaging 91 yards per game on the ground, whereas last year they were at 167. So we'll see. But if they get that game going, they still got a month before they play BYU. Alan Bowman, more than capable. They've got some great receivers. So when it comes to the red zone, they're going to have the whole playbook open to the quarterback. That's going to be more difficult to defend. UCF, the next game, they lead the country in rushing. This was bonkers. I was looking it up. They have 376 rushing yards per game. I thought, wow, that's incredible. They're They have more yards rushing than Army. Army's at 356, and then Boise's the next team at 311. But when you look at the shape of the graph, it tilts really high when you get to UCF, and then it tilts down pretty quickly before it starts leveling out. So UCF, KJ Jefferson, more than capable enough quarterback in the red zone to be a threat in the passing game. And then the next week after UCF, Utah, they're the 29th best ground game in the country right now. They're running the ball really well. They've got, if Cam Rising is back, they will have a more than capable threat, especially with Keithy in the end zone. So I think that's something to watch. And then Kansas the next week after that. They have the 16th best ground game in the country right now. And then Jalen Daniels, he's not having the year I thought he was going to have. Kansas is not having the year I thought they were going to have. I may have missed on that. And then, but Jalen Daniels in the red zone more than capable. So what I'm pulling out from this is BYU has an area of opportunity to improve in not letting teams march down the field on them. And I'm not saying that this is egregious. I think Kansas State, again, it one of the better rushing games, and BYU was not able to really slow it down. So that's an area of concern coming up in the future games here. So one other point is Kansas State actually better than BYU? This is a question I've been thinking through in my head all week. I've seen both sides of it, and we need to consider the perception of Kansas State coming into the game here, and of BYU. So Kansas State, they're 2 years removed from winning the Big 12, and really one season in between when they won the Big 12, and then they come into the season ranked. They've been ranked for a better part of a couple of years now, and they're number 13 coming into this game, whereas BYU really struggled last year. I do think BYU gets fair recognition. I think BYU has a name that gets ranked sooner than other people. For instance, UCF. Now, BYU's 4-0. They had a really good win. UCF, I think they're going to get ranked. They don't have as quite of as good of a win as BYU, but that's an example of a team that I think BYU has a better brand right now. In general, I guess historically better brand, and so they get a little bit better ranking. Kansas State, though, I think has a better brand overall in the country than BYU to a degree, to where if they're both 10-1, there's a likelihood that Kansas State gets ranked better. Unless in this case BYU beat Kansas State, obviously the voters put BYU ahead. All that is to say is that I think for fans on both sides of the aisle and across the country, there was a perception that Kansas State was a better team because historically they've been a better team. That may not be the case this year, though. It may actually be the case that BYU is a better team. Now, as I mentioned, Kansas State dominated in the run game, and so it gave, if you're a Kansas State fan, or you just think Kansas State's better, you feel, okay, well, Kansas State dominated this game. There were several plays that turned out such that this felt like a 1 in a million game. The fumble that is scooped for a score because it happened to fumble. Giddens happened to fumble in a way that the ball bounces to where several BYU players could scoop and score. And then the interception, the couple of the interceptions, you think, yeah, like those are unforced errors. It was more on Kansas State as opposed to BYU doing something phenomenal. The penalties, I think if you're Kansas State, you're thinking these are driven by the new environment. They wouldn't have happened in Manhattan. And BYU really only drove the field once and actually scored, and that was a field goal. The rest of the time, they had very good, favorable field position. And so, and I've listened to some Kansas State fans, and I can see their point where they're thinking that that Kansas State gave this game away. And if they'd played this game in Manhattan, would that have turned out the same way? Well, we don't know. We could get into theoreticals all day. If they played 10 times in Manhattan, yes, I think Kansas State would win 7 or 8 times. If they played in Provo 10 times, I think BYU would win 7 or 8 times. If they played on a neutral field, that one's hard to say. But if you're a BYU fan, you're looking at this and you're thinking, well, BYU did what good teams do, and they take advantage of what's in front of them. They did create the turnovers. They forced a fumble. They put pressure. So the play when the interception from Batty, I think it was a corner. I forget which corner, but it was a corner blitz, or no, it was like a nickel blitz. I think it was Jacob Robinson. Puts pressure on Avery Johnson. He has to get rid of the ball sooner, and he makes, honestly, it was a bit of a Jake Retzlaff type interception that we saw against SMU. It was on a similar screenplay, and had to throw the ball pretty quickly. That to me is a combination of good play calling, the players executing, and then Batty being ready and everyone being in their spots. And then that interception from Taggart, credit Taggart, he's had 2 in the midst previous weeks, and he missed, and this one he got. And he was in the right spot. And again, that was a pressure that forced Avery Johnson out of the pocket. He could have run, but credit to him for trying to pass. Furthermore, Kansas State, while they got to the red zone, they didn't turn those field goals into touchdowns. The game would have looked pretty different had they turned those into touchdowns. I did the calculation, and let's say that they don't fumble that ball, and they go down and they score before the half, and they turn their other and then they score right after the half. I mean, they could have gone from being up 20-6 to now they're down 31-6, and what was it? It was something like a 39-point swing is what I thought. I did the math. I'll have to redo that later. But if Kansas State turns their 3 field goals into 3 touchdowns, 21-38, I mean, the game actually looks pretty different. And at the end of the day, BYU stopped them. Not all those. It wasn't. You can't blame it all on the penalties. And then Kansas State has a challenge right now with Avery Johnson because he's not yet a true passing threat. I like his potential. If you watch him, he throws the ball well, and he threw the ball. He can throw the ball deep for sure. He missed on several of those deep balls, and that takes a lot of practice. I think that takes experience. I think that takes timing with both players. I think that does take a skill for a quarterback to be able to drop the ball in the right spot. He did have receivers drop balls. So though, I don't think it's that he can't be a passing threat. I think it's that he has not yet been a true passing threat. And if he doesn't become a passing threat sooner in this season, then I think Kansas State is going to end up losing 2 or 3 more games, because while they can move the ball really well, it's going to challenge them in the red zone. And for defenses that, like Oklahoma State, like Iowa State, some of the better defenses, Kansas, that can slow down the run a little bit, that's going to create problems for them. So at the end of the day, who's the better team? Like I said, that's one of the beauties about sports, and one of the maddening things is you can get into subjectives all day and theoreticals all day. But you do have to give credit to the team that won at the end of the day. And I like both teams. I mean, obviously I'm a BYU fan, but I like Kansas State, and I'm optimistic about who they are. I think they're a better team than what showed up on Saturday night. I really do. And we'll see in a little bit where, I'll give you my pick between them and Oklahoma State in a little bit, but teaser, I think Kansas State's going to do well in that game. So Let's talk Baylor real quick. So Baylor, as I've been profiling their team on statistically, they look like a combination of Kansas State light and a little bit BYU. And then they're a little bit themselves, but when you look at them as compared to last year, they are doing better than they were last year. So when I look at their yards allowed per game last year, I mean they were allowing. I don't have the season total, but last year through week 4, they'd had 2 games where they'd given up over 400 yards. This year, they only have 1 game where they've given up 400 yards. And last year, they had, in fact, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 games where they gave up over 400 yards. So their defense has improved. Now, Dave Aranda, I did this in my preview of Baylor a few episodes back. Dave Aranda is taking over the play calling for Baylor this year, and you can see it in their defense. They are allowing, I think it's 16 points a game that they're allowing, and that is, it is 34th best. Yes, 16.8. It's 34th best in the country right now. Coming into the Kansas State game, Kansas State was allowing fewer points than BYU. Obviously, that's not the case now. But so you could see that their defense is certainly gotten better. They have an 83 net yard differential, so they're getting 83 yards more per game, and they've got about a 13-point differential, so they're scoring 13 points more each game. Couple other notes about them: they've got 12 sacks on the year, which is where does that rank? That it ranks pretty well in the country, but the note that the caveat there is that they're ranked 17th best in the country. BYU, of note, they've got 7 sacks, 74th best in the country, which, hey, 7 sacks through 4 games, I'll take it. BYU had 11 sacks last year, so BYU's on pace to get 21 sacks this year. I'll take it. That's good. Baylor had 8 sacks against Colorado, and they've got 12 sacks for the season. So I'm not concerned about Baylor's defensive line being a real problem for BYU, because Colorado is leading the nation in sacks allowed, and they've allowed 16. So I think that was more a symptom of Colorado being really bad, and Baylor doing a good job taking advantage of it. Kansas State, they also have 12 sacks on the season, so they had a really good defensive front, and BYU allowed, I forget if it was 1 or 2 sacks, but BYU's allowed 5 on the season, so I don't think that's going to be a big problem for BYU. And then a couple other things is that Baylor is much more run heavy, so they are 2 run plays for every 1 pass play. I think that'll be something to watch, and that's actually going to play into how I think Baylor's strategy is to win this game. I think for Baylor, watching the film against Colorado, so Sawyer Robertson, I don't know if it's going to be him or Daquan Finn. Daquan Finn was much more of a true dual threat, but Sawyer Robinson, they ran him on the ground, and he had on a 4th and 1 or 4th and 2, he had about a 45-yard touchdown run. It was a designed quarterback keeper from the shotgun. And he doesn't wow you with his speed, but he had several runs where he ripped it off. Now Baylor is not prolific on the offensive side. They 68th best ground game at 167 yards per game, 98th best passing game at 197 yards per game. So that's where they're decent in the running game. They're not as great in the passing game. As I'm watching film, though, they did have quite a few passes where it's just a receiver fly, just runs straight out and back shoulder to the sideline. They caught several of those. BYU's been really good in the pass defense this year. So I don't think that that's going to be an area where Baylor's going to really be able to take advantage. But it's still something to watch. In fact, when I look at where BYU is, they're 16th best pass defense in terms of yards. They allow 132 yards per game. So and Baylor's 22nd best. They allow 142 yards. So where I think that this is going is, okay, so there's four possible outcomes, right? And there's four possible outcomes of any game. Baylor wins big, BYU wins big, Baylor wins close, BYU wins close. I think Baylor's strategy is going to be so they run 2 plays for every 1 pass play. I think they're going to look to run the ball, pass in opportunistic moments. I think this is going to be a slow down BYU's offense by running the ball and then play really good defense, tough defense, hard-nosed defense. And then I think it's going to be special teams, field position game. So see if you can't move the ball on BYU. I think they're not going to be able to pass the ball super well unless they get the running game really going well. But if they get the running game going well, then that could be problematic. But if they're kind of even struggling to move the ball, I think that's what you see this be a special teams game, field position game. Shorten the clock by running it, and keep the BYU offense off the field for as long as you can. As far as those outcomes, I put Baylor winning big at about a 10% chance, BYU winning big, and I put that's not a big chance because BYU's defense I think is good enough to keep them in it. BYU winning big, I put that at a 20% chance. Baylor has a really good defense, but BYU's offense is a little better. Baylor winning close, I think that's a 30% chance, and then BYU winning close, I think that's a 40% chance. I expect this to be a close game. I think it's going to be a dogfight because if you're Baylor, a couple of things, you just came off of a heartbreaking loss to Colorado, and then if you look out at your schedule, Baylor they got a couple things. One, the team itself. I was listening to some of the player interviews this week, and they've realized that they don't want to spiral the way that they spiraled last year. That is not what they want to do. When you look at last year, let's see how I've got it right here. They lost their first 2, and then they already kind of started to spiral as the season went on. They came out 2-3. They actually got to 3-4, and then they really spiraled and they lost their last 5. But even out of the gate, they honestly were already in the spiral, and they picked up a couple of really not that great wins: Long Island, UCF on a miracle, and Cincinnati. So when I look at their schedule this year, they've got BYU at home. They kind of have to win this game because then they go on the road to Iowa State. That's going to be hard. Then they go on the road to Texas Tech. That's going to be hard. And then they're home against Oklahoma State, home against TCU, and then they go at West Virginia before they go on the road at Houston, and then they're home against Kansas. So it's possible that Baylor may not be favored in any more games except for at Houston. And we'll see how Kansas is doing at that point. But Dave Aranda needs to keep his job. He needs the players to perform super well. Baylor has to win this game to build momentum, to have a shot at those road games and that home slate. I mean, they've got a difficult schedule coming up here. So I think they're going to be playing with desperation and with urgency, which I think is going to keep the game close. And And if they get Jake to revert to his old turnover self, I think he's going to give up one turnover. I mean, just count on that. But you hope that it's not in a really bad spot. But if they get him to force 2 or 3 turnovers, they shorten that field. They did have a special teams touchdown last week, a kickoff return. I don't think Baylor is going to blow BYU out, but that's how I think they could make it a dogfight. So my predictions for the week, and of note on the special teams, BYU's had really good special teams the last 3 weeks. So you can kind of feel confident that the special teams will come to play. But nonetheless, as far as how my predictions, I'll get to my prediction here in a second, and then talk through predictions for the rest of the conference. As far as Baylor goes, a couple things here is they actually the prediction here. I lost my train of thought for a second there. I had to make sure the video was still going. Baylor or BYU, I've been thinking each week. Well, Southern Illinois, Wyoming, I was pretty sure BYU was going to win. Wyoming, they did even better than I thought. SMU and Kansas State, as the week went on and leading up to that day, this could be the fan optimism and the hope, but I started to believe more. Not believe, that's not the right word. My view on where it was going to go shifted as I dove into the numbers more. And I thought, all right, SMU, Kansas State, the more I look at it, the more I think BYU's got the edge here. Or there's a path. I should say there was a path. And in Kansas State, the path played out just a little more dramatically than I thought. Because I thought if they're going to beat, and you can look, I tweeted against both, in both situations, their defense, it's going to be on the backs of their defense that they're going to win. And with Avery Johnson, create turnovers, and that's what they did. So this game, the more I've been looking at it, the more I think that Baylor's going to come to play. But BYU has the edge in on the defensive side, and they have a few more weapons on the offensive side. BYU's created twice as many turnovers as Baylor. So I think that BYU's going to get a favorable turnover, keep the margin at least, the turnover margin at least neutral, if not win by 1. And I think this is going to be a sweated out game, but I do think BYU is going to come away with the victory. So I've got BYU 27, Baylor 24. Okay, let's go around the Big 12 real quick. Kansas State, Oklahoma State, and the picks there. Kansas State's favored by 5. I am going to go with Kansas State in this game because they're at home. I think they're gonna come. They're gonna have a feeling of sickness that they felt sick last week and they got to get out of their system. Oklahoma State, I think, has a little bit more of soul searching. They're trying to figure out what we know who we are, but we're trying to figure out how to be ourselves again. Kansas State's a little more like we know who we are. We totally goofed up last week, so we're going to go out and do what we do. So I like Kansas State in that game. But watch Ollie Gordon, because if he gets that running game going, then I think Oklahoma State will be right for the rest of the season. TCU and Kansas. Well, I liked Kansas coming into this game, and I got to flip now. I got to flip, and I got to go with TCU. Kansas has a good ground game, but their offense hasn't clicked the way that I thought it would. They're a 1.5-point favorite, but TCU, Josh Hoover, so he's 1,400 yards on the season, 11 touchdowns, two interceptions. Kansas' defense hasn't played as well as I thought, so I'm going with TCU in this game. UCF, Colorado. this game 2:30 Fox. I think this game is gonna be more of a statement for UCF than it will. I think the country will probably look at it at Colorado because it's Colorado. But I really think the opportunity here, hopefully people come away with, is saying, wow, look how good UCF is. They got one of the best backs in the country in RJ Harvey. And through 3 games, he's got 8 touchdowns and 448 yards. So he's incredible. I've got UCF in this one. I think they're going to win, and I don't think it's going to be real close. Something like a two touchdown, maybe 3 touchdown. I don't think it's going to be a blowout, but I think 2 or 3 touchdown edge. Iowa State, Houston. That Iowa State's on the road, but I've got Iowa State in that one. They are quietly building momentum, and they're going to continue to quietly build momentum until I think it's going to be 7-8 games into the season when we might look up and they're either undefeated or they've got 1 loss, and it could be that we get towards the last few weeks of the season and they are in pole position for the Big 12 title. But not very many people are going to speak about it. And then we got Cincinnati and Texas Tech, both 3-1. That's at Texas Tech. Cincinnati is running the ball well this year, as they have, but they're passing the ball well as well. Texas Tech, they had that weird loss against Washington State, but then they've looked pretty good since. I think Lubbock is so hard to play in, so pretty much anytime Texas Tech is at home, I've got to give them the edge. So I'm going with Texas Tech here. And then Utah and Arizona. I don't know if the rest of the people are on to Arizona the way that I think they are. Now, I had one Arizona fan come after me after the Arizona preview, and I come in with good intentions. I like Noah Fafita and Tetro McMillan. So I mean this not in a bad way, but I don't think Arizona is as good. Actually, Arizona's turning out to be what I thought. I thought they were going to have a challenge moving into the Big 12 and with new coaches. And Arizona's given up 11 sacks on the season. Utah, we know, sack Lake City. So I actually don't think this game is going to be close. Utah's favored by 8. I know Cam Rising, if he was playing, I would think that this game would actually be like a 3 touchdown. I think Utah would win by 20, 30 points going away. As it stands, I think Utah still is going to win by a couple touchdowns. I don't think it's going to be close, though, because I think Noah Fafita is going to be, I don't think he's going to have much time in the pocket, and they're not going to be able to run the ball super well. So, couple other games out there. The big one, obviously, Alabama, Georgia. Ooh, that one's tough. Alabama's at home, though, and I like them. I like Jalen Milroe, but I'm going to go with Georgia here. I think Georgia's going to pull it out on the road in a close one. Clemson is a team for me that I recommend watching for 2 reasons. One, they're scoring gobs of points. And 2, they remind me a little bit right now of Oregon from 2 years ago. So there were a lot of questions about Clemson coming in and questions about are they fading out of being at the top of the ACC, and they lose to Georgia week 1 pretty bad, and not as actually bad as Oregon did. And then questions about like who are they? Are they really that good? And if you remember against Oregon 2 years ago, Oregon got blown out, and then they blow out an FCS team. And then against BYU, it's Oregon fans themselves didn't know who are we, and then they blow out BYU. Clemson kind of did that to North Carolina State last week. They've got Stanford this week. I just think Clemson's a team to watch. I would not be shocked if I think it's going to end up being Clemson and Miami in the ACC title game, because Clemson's finally starting to look good under Garrett Riley as the offensive coordinator. So with that, the last thing I want to hit on is Big 12 title race. As I look at the schedules and I look at who's in what position right now, I think this is actually going to come down to Utah, Iowa State, and UCF, surprisingly. I'm not ready yet to say BYU. I think we'll have to see. BYU, I think, has a really good chance to get to 6-0. But then that Oklahoma State, it's can they get through Oklahoma State, UCF, Utah, Kansas? I mean, that's just a brutal stretch, which I think if BYU comes out with only 2 losses, that's impressive. And then they obviously have a shot. But I think BYU is going to end up falling 1 or 2 losses short. So they're like a 9-3, 8-4 team. Utah, as I look at their schedule, Arizona at Arizona State, home against TCU. That's going to be a tough game, but because they're at home, Cam Rising could be back. I like that. At Houston, home against BYU. At Colorado, home against Iowa State. At UCF. So Utah has a really good shot to get to 10-0. And then home against Iowa State, because it's at home, I think Utah is going to be favored in that one. We'll see again about Cam Rising. But then UCF, I mean, Utah's probably going to drop either the Iowa State game and or the UCF game. But Iowa State, their path also is not super challenging. At Houston, home against Baylor. At West Virginia, home against UCF. Tough game, but they got it at home. Home against Texas Tech. They go at Kansas. That'll be tricky. They got home against Cincinnati, and then they've got the last 2 games at Utah, home against Kansas State. So they also have a path to finishing 11-1 to 9-3, somewhere in there. And then UCF also home against Colorado. They got at Florida. It's not a conference game. Home against Cincinnati. They've got the tough road trip at Iowa State. But then they've got BYU at home. It's going to be so tough for BYU. They're home against Arizona. They go at Arizona State, at West Virginia, home against Utah. I also think that they have a path to something like an 11-1, 9-3 schedule. So I think those 3, because they have easier schedules, I think those 3 are in pole position right now to get into the title game for the Big 12, which UCF and Iowa State, I remember seeing something. I think The Athletic had the note on them coming into the season, which a lot of people said, okay, I don't believe it, but it's actually starting to look better and better. And BYU, I missed. I'm not going to readjust my expectations right now. I'm going to wait for the Baylor game before I say, okay, yeah, BYU should get to 8-4, 9-3, whatever. I had them at 4-8. They could still go 4-8. Don't think they will, but I feel really confident now saying that I do expect BYU to go to a bowl game this year now, or I'll expect in the sense that I think they will, not that my expectation, my standard is that they have to go to a bowl game. So there you got it. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, like, subscribe, share any comment, any feedback that you've got, any thoughts that you have, any stats that you want me to dig into and look up. And appreciate the listen, and hope you have a great day.